We've studied the essential tools and options related to illustration the program has. But now it's time to talk about other features that might still be important, but are a bit more situational. All snapping functionality can be enabled or disabled by clicking in the first icon in the snap bar. There are 3 sections in this bar, all preceded by a button which enables or disables the entire section. Once you snap something into position, a little message appears in place letting you know it's snapping. The first section enables you to snap to bounding boxes of any object. A bounding box is a rectangle that fits the whole object, no matter the silhouette. So for example, if you rotate a rectangle, the bounding box of the object is gonna still be a rectangle. The toggles in this section lets you enable snapping to corners, edges, midpoints, and even the center point of an object bounding box. I find myself rarely needing to snap to bounding boxes, so I never enable this type of snapping. The second section is a little more useful. This section lets you snap to paths and nodes. Of all the toggles here, I found that I only need this one. This one lets you snap to nodes from a curve. All the other ones let you, in some way or another, snap to arbitrary points in the path, which is more distracting and less useful than you'd think. The third section lets you snap to other points, like centers, handles, and text anchors. There is one last section. This one has no main toggle and enables the snapping to the page, grids, or guides. Since this is a course about illustration, we skip both pages and guides, which are helper lines you can drag from the left upper corner in the canvas or from the rulers. But the grids require a little more explanation. You can enable rectangular and axonometric grids for the entire document. For this, you need to open the Document Properties dialog, go to File, Document Properties, and then go to the Grids tab. You create a grid with the Creation dropdown. Here you select the type and click New. After you create the grid, a tab with options appear. Here you can configure the grid. The first 3 checkboxes are universal for the 2 types of grids. You can enable or disable the entire grid with the first checkbox. You can make it invisible, but keep the snapping enabled with the second checkbox. When you zoom out, some of the grid may be recreated to match the zoom. With the third checkbox enabled, you only snap to the grids that are actually visible. Otherwise, the grids may be too close together and they may beat the purpose of enable snapping in the first place. For the rectangular grid, the origin value moves the grid up or down. The spacing is just for the spacing between grids. If you want to make the grid bigger, just make the spacing in X and Y bigger. The nice thing about having different values for X and Y is that you can create non-square grids. You can have a different looking line every certain number of normal lines. This is so you can see better. You change the color of the minor or major type of grid with the color selector. By default, both types have the same color and alpha. The alpha is indicated with the first half of the bar. You can also change the quantity of lines between a major grid with this dropdown. If you have a very dense grid, dots may be better than lines. You can change to dots with this button. The axonometric grid has a couple of different options. First, you change the size of the grid with the spacing value. The angle changes the inclination of the grid. Probably the most useful type of grid is going to be the default one, the one with both angles set at 30. This will create a classic isometric grid. Finally, if you go to the Snap tab, right next to the Grids tab, you'll see a group of options related to snapping. The first three groups change the distance needed to snap. If the option is set to always snap, then the selected object will always snap to something no matter the distance. You don't want to touch anything here, the default options are just fine. The Spray tool lets you spray the selected object. This is great to quickly create a random and organic looking distribution of objects that otherwise will be impossible or at least very tedious to place manually. In the tool controls bar, there are 4 modes. They change the way the sprayer works. With the first mode selected, you spray copies of the selected objects, based on the values set in the rest of the bar. If you have more than one object selected, then they'll be sprayed randomly with the others. This is the mode that you'll be using the most. With the second mode selected, you'll spray clones of the selected objects. As is to be expected, if you modify one of the objects, you modify all of the clones. The third and fourth mode are less used. With the third mode, you merge all objects into a single path as you place them. This could be useful to create interesting shape contours. And with the last mode, you delete copies of only the selected objects. So if you place a lot of different objects when you sprayed, now you can delete only the object type you want. As far as the modifiers options, you have a lot of control, especially since you can bound any of the options to tablet pressure for extra versatility. Of course, you can change the size of the spray and the amount of placed objects. You can randomize the rotation, scale, and scatter. Then you have more refined options, like if you want to apply over solid or transparent sections. Useful if you have the canvas set to transparent as it is by default. Or if you want the objects to overlap or not, as well as changing the colors as you place objects. With all these values and options combined, you have a huge amount of control. The best thing you could do is to experiment and see which configuration of values work for each individual case. The Tweak tool allows you to do 2 things. You can apply transformations to a large quantity of objects at once by painting with the cursor, or modify path by sculpting with the cursor. Keep in mind that this tool will only affect selected objects, so make sure you select all the objects you want to affect before using this tool. In the tool controls, you can set the width of the cursor and the force with which the changes will be applied. The force can be mapped to the pressure input if you're using a tablet. In the mode section, you have access to 13 different modes that Tweak can use. They more or less fit into 3 categories. There are the object manipulation modes, the first 6, the path manipulation mode from the 7th to the 10th, and the object appearance mode, the rest. The object manipulation modes are mostly useful to use in conjunction with the spray tool that we just saw a while ago. This mode lets you perform all types of transformation very easily on large quantities of shapes. You can modify the position, scale, and rotation. This is mostly useful to randomize the values and create a more chaotic range of objects. Each mode has an alternative modifier that gets active with the Shift key. To know what each does, simply leave the mouse on top of the mode, and a tooltip will let you know what they do. The path manipulation modes is where things get interesting. Depending on the option, you can push or pull different parts of a path, or shrink and expand. There's also a mode to roughen a path. With these modes you can easily create organic shapes. A small note before we continue. This tool will not work on a straight section, even if the handles are active. This most surely is a bug, so you may have to add a small curvature to a section you want to affect before you can use this tool. The third group of modes changes the color and blur of the objects in different ways. You can paint the selected color, give the objects a random color, or just blur the objects. The strength of the color or blur is based on the strength value. Just like in the case of the object manipulation modes, the modes from this section are usually used to paint a large quantity of objects. The bucket is an interesting tool. You can create a shape that will fill any enclosed area really quick by just clicking. But there is a big problem. The created shape is not created using Boolean operations, but rather it's generated using pixel information. So the position of the view when you click to fill is important. If you are zoomed right in, the fill will maintain decently the edges. If you are zoomed really far, the fill will leave a lot of spaces in the intersections. So the fill will never be perfect. There is always gonna be some space in the borders, no matter how close you zoom when you use it. Because of this, the tool loses a lot of usefulness. To help solve this problem, there are a few options in the tool controls. You can play around with this dropdown. By default, it tries to fill based on the color information. But you can change it, so instead it tries to fill based on the difference between hue, saturation, alpha, or individual colors. If you pick the right options here, it can improve the quality of the fill. There is also the grow shrink input. Here you can make the object fit its surrounding a little better. You can play with these options. However, I prefer to leave everything as it is and use dynamic offset to make the shape fit better. The bucket can have its uses if you care more about speed than accuracy. But for everything else, you should take your time and create the fills manually by duplicating shapes and performing Boolean operations. I want to talk briefly about extensions. Extensions are plugins that are built into the program, just like the built-in filters. You get extensions to create different types of paths, to work with pixel images, to export, to work with web pages. There are a lot of them, and just like with the filters or the path effects, extensions are something you are better off playing with by yourself. What's really interesting is that you can assign shortcuts to a lot of them. All you have to do is go to the shortcut preferences. And of course, if you want, you can write your own extensions. There are guides you can find online if you're a programmer and feel up to the task. To be honest, extensions are a bit like filters. You might find yourself using one here and there, but for the most part, you can skip them and you won't miss much. These were the rest of the tools and options I thought were useful for illustration. Depending on your workflow and the way you like to illustrate, a tool that one artist thinks is essential may be completely useless to you. I encourage you to test and play around with the other tools and see if you can find them some use I didn't. So now that we've gone through the entire program and all the features I think are important for illustration, I want to give you some important tips that I think may save you a lot of headaches in the long run.